Today's topic is one that I often see discussed. I would like to, on one hand, give a bit of my own perspective on this topic, but also offer the option to think about this topic from a different point of view, something that many people don't really seem to consider when thinking about this topic. The topic is, which role is the hardest in Smite? We have 5 roles in Smite. We have the jungler, we have the solo laner, we have the mid laner, we have the support, and we have the ADC or hunter. Those 5 roles all fulfill different purposes and all have different difficulties in different regards. We go through all the roles one by one and talk about what about that role needs to be paid attention to, especially specifically for that role, and what in general is important for that role. After we've done that, we can directly look at which role is the hardest. Let's begin with the solo laners. A solo laner needs to have a very good understanding of item builds. You have to specifically counter your enemy, and for that, the more you know about items, the better, so it's a very big factor when it comes to that role. You also need to know a lot about matchups. For a solo laner, the game often begins before the actual game starts, because for this character, it's specifically important to counterpick the opponent. It's not like this is not important for other roles, but for the solo laner, it's specifically important. It's also important for the solo laner to be able to fulfill different niches in the game, different purposes. You will have solo laners that are mainly lane bullies, and their strength is in the early game, and they should be played as such. Whereas other solo laners are a lot more team oriented, so whereas for example with hunters the purpose towards the end game always stays the same, you would play a Raven and a Vamana very differently in late game. A solo laner needs to have a decent situational awareness in order to know when he might get ganked, but this is not as problematic as for other roles because he can only get ganked from one side. He also needs to understand, in regards to situational awareness and map awareness, where the enemy team is and if it's worth teleporting somewhere else on the map, as well as keeping track of at least the blue buff and the elementals, because that's kind of the area he has to control in many situations. Solo lane is often won through the small victories and a lot of min-maxing, so having the capacity to be able to get the most benefit out of every small thing is a very good trait for a solo laner that is very important for him. For a jungler, things are a little different. A jungler does not have to care as much about, for example, matchups. There are obviously counter matchups in the jungle, for example, think Ratatoskr and Fenrir, but they are not as emphasized as is the case in the solo lane. Instead, other things are a lot more important. The map awareness becomes very crucial, same as the rotational awareness. A jungler needs to be in absolute control of the map at all times. This is especially important in regards to rotation timers as well, so he can get the most out of going to one side of the map, getting the camps there, and then maybe going for a gank. This is like this map understanding and when to gank where kind of belongs on the same section, and that's a lot of what the jungler is about. A jungler doesn't have a lane to farm, so he really needs to understand how to farm efficiently off camps instead of a normal lane, with not having the same kind of unconditional XP. Similar to solo laners, junglers need to pay a lot of attention to build. This is not so much about counter building, but rather the fact that every jungler is built in a different way, and the gods in this niche are kind of very different from each other. For example, Kali and Thor have completely different functions, so once again, in the team fights, you have a completely different purpose depending on who you are, which is basically only similar between the solo laner and the jungler in most cases. So, for example, here we have a Thor who would engage with his ultimate quite often towards late game, whereas a Willish would look for single target picks in late game. The mid laner has kind of shifted in his playstyle throughout the seasons, and especially now with Bombas Mask, we have some very unusual strategies that kind of give him a bit of a different purpose. Mid laners already had to have very good map awareness beforehand, simply because they can always get ganked from 2 sides. With this additional rotation that they have to do and the control of the mid area that they often have to take over themselves, there's even more map awareness and rotational awareness that is important for them. While they rarely farm alone, so farming in itself is not the hardest thing for them to do, it's very important for them to be able to team fight pretty much early into the game, because their area is often the first one that sees any kind of team aggression over the single target fight. What separates a good mid laner from a bad one is what the mid laner does in downtimes between waves. A good mid laner will find good rotations, will maybe rotate into another lane and get a kill or secure an objective, while a bad mid laner will mostly just sit around mid lane and doing nothing. In teamfight, the mid laner often needs position better than other characters because many of them don't have the best escape tools, and even if they do, they're still really squishy and often get focused out. So if a mid laner is not able to position properly in the backline and see when aggression is needed, he will easily get picked out. So this teamfight awareness is once again very important here. The hunter is in a very different boat. For hunters, for example, the build itself is not a complex part. Most hunters can make use of similar builds, and that's not a complex essential part to their skill. They also do not need the highest map awareness. They usually aren't even that responsible of warding themselves. They often have the supports warding for them, and they really just need to see ganks coming in from one side. They have a lot of time to farm, so there's a lot of things that don't factor in as much. What does factor in a lot is min-maxing once again. They really need to get as much as possible out of a single wave, try to last it, try to get rotations in between, even if it's just to kill small buff minions, anything like that, anything that will give them a little bit of a lead over the opponent and that can allow them to snowball and get into late game stronger. The other part that's extremely crucial for them is mechanical skill. As a hunter, you're supposed to hit your basics. If you don't hit your basics, you're basically a useless hunter. So even in the early laning phase, in the trading phase, it's going to be very important that you are as mechanically skilled as possible in order to keep this aim up, whereas other roles are just more forgiving. Many mid laners don't really need to hit their basics as long as they land their abilities. Many assassins can get away with missing more basics, but hunters really rely on their basics for the most part, unless you're looking at the very ability focused ones. This applies all the way down to late game, where one hit can basically mean the death of a character with almost half health, if we're talking about a crit build, for example. Last but not least, we have support. Now, support, I think, has the most similarities with another role here, and that's jungle. Both have to have very good map awareness, rotational awareness, and see how they can get their farm the most effectively without actually having their own lane. They're in many, many ways very similar. However, the support has to understand better how to position in a teamfight. The jungler will often just walk on the outskirts of a teamfight and get the backlines, which is, in my opinion, a relatively easy thing to do, whereas the support is the one who is mostly in charge of making sure that everyone survives. And as easy as that may sound with a well-coordinated team, if you've ever had to do this with an uncoordinated team, you know how much of a pain it can be to try and keep all your sheep together. The support needs to have a pretty good understanding of item builds as well, because his counter items or his aura items are often for the whole team, and if you have the wrong auras for the whole team or the wrong counters to the enemy team, it can allow certain characters to snowball way more than they should be if you as a support build differently. Even in the support niche, we have, similar to the jungler or the soul laner, very different focus supports, though most are able to frontline to a decent extent and kind of have those teamfight picks. There's still a very significant difference between Khepri and Fafnir in how they operate in a teamfight. While every role is charged with warding, there is a special emphasis for the support to ward, and while this is not the hardest thing in the world to do, it's still something that needs to be paid additional attention to. It is especially important for your backing timers and to keep this track of objectives, because they can really win or lose you the game. So now that we've talked about all roles, which one is the hardest? You may have noticed that every role has different traits which are hard for them, and because of that, I propose a different approach to this question, a different angle to this question. The question should not be which role is the hardest, but which role is the hardest for you. All of these different factors can make the difficulty of a certain role harder for you than for others. If you're bad with matchup knowledge and item knowledge, but you're a very mechanically skilled player, then you're probably better off playing ADC than you are playing solo. If you are somebody who has a very high amount of map awareness, but is not that mechanically skilled, then you're probably better off playing jungle than ADC. And as such, there are arguments for and against every single role in the game, and a lot of it comes down to what you're good at. I personally am very bad mechanically, and I know I suck at most ADCs. There are some ADCs that I can play because they are less reliant on their basic attacks and more on their abilities, and that's my kind of playstyle, so I don't have much of a problem with them. But if I have to play an ADC that relies mostly on basic attacks and doesn't have a slow, then I have a problem. That is, for me, the hardest role. That doesn't mean that ADC is the hardest role for somebody who plays ADC all the time. Likewise, there is a certain overlap between different roles. For example, somebody who can play support very well is most likely not complete trash at jungle, Whereas a mid laner will often be able to play ADC as well, because there are certain similarities between the two roles. There are many players that consider support and jungle the hardest roles because they struggle with the concept of ganking properly and farming while in the jungle and the map awareness that comes with it. But if those are not factors you struggle with, then that doesn't apply to you. Likewise, a lot of people think that mid is the easiest role, but if you're somebody who does not feel comfortable playing a god that has to switch between very fast clear and then aggression and then also very good positioning in teamfights, as opposed to somebody like a warrior who can get away with a little more sloppy teamfight because he's tankier, then mid may be the hardest role for you. If you think a role is particularly easy, good for you. Maybe you should play that role if you're not playing it already. But if you want to brag about playing the hardest role in the game, then maybe reconsider, because it may just not be the hardest role for everyone else. As a matter of fact, it may not even be the hardest role for you, because otherwise, why would you play it? Sure, some people will be looking for the challenge to always play the hardest role, but really, is that more to stroke your own ego and tell yourself that you're playing the hardest role, or is it actually the hardest role? Just some food for thought, because I've seen this discussion over and over and over again, and I've got asked so often, and I've actually given different responses because I just didn't really know how to respond to it until I really put some thought into it. So that's my take on it. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was insightful, I hope this was interesting. If you enjoyed this kind of content and you're not subscribed yet, I would much appreciate if you click that sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. We got something really cool coming up tomorrow. I won't spoil anymore, but I really recommend checking that out if you want to improve your own gameplay. Duke Sloth, out.